So the World Championship qualifiers are underway, and Stage 2 is going to be next week. And regarding the format that we're in, I think most people can agree that there's generally 2 to 3-ish top decks in this format that are above the rest. And unsurprisingly, they're all fire decks. You know, we have the pure classic standard Snake Eyes from, you know, months ago with or without the Kashtira engine. We have Fire King Snake Eyes, which is a new addition from the new pack, and we have Rescue Ace Wee Woo Wee Woo. So, which one of these 3 fire decks is actually going to be the best this format and is the best for grinding Stage 2 of the qualifiers? Why don't we go over each one of these and the pros and cons of each? So, first we'll begin with the classic, just pure standard Snake Eyes, which is probably the out of these 3 is probably the build that I think the least amount of people will think is the best deck, because it's not new. First of all, it's not a new toy like the Fire King Snake Eyes version, and also it has received notable hits on the ban list, including limiting of Ash to 1 and limiting of Wanted to 1. And obviously in a pure build, this is more important because you're more reliant on these specific cards than other engines to function. So what are the pros for running pure Snake Eyes or Kashtira Snake Eyes, whichever way you want to exactly build this? Number 1 is it has the most room for non-engine, like straight up, because you don't jam in other engines into the deck. You can just put in a lot of hand traps, and you know, hand traps are good this format. Hand traps are probably the best way you want to stop your opponent, like stop them before they make a board. And you can even add a Kashtira engine in if you so wish, just as a way to play through opposing hand traps going first. For instance, with Unicorn, right? Unicorn is just a really good extender in the deck. It gets you 2 bodies to where even if your, say, Ash gets negated, you still have the Unicorn up. This still lets you get the Princess. The Princess can revive the Ash, and Ash can send the Birth to summon from your deck, and then you can continue playing from there. Conversely, if you don't want to run the Kashtira engine, you could run more hand traps, because right now this is at a 13 hand trap count, which is okay, but not the best. But if you want to remove the 5 card Kashtira engine, that's suddenly 5 more room for hand traps. You can go up to even 18 hand traps, and then you can just bolster your chances of opening 2 hand traps when going second, more so than any other deck in the format. And obviously, to go with the amount of non-engine that you can run, the reason you can run a lot of non-engine is also that this deck, compared to the other 2 decks, has the least amount of bricks and like just bad or dead draws you want to see. For example, you have like Snake Eyes Oak, which is not an ideal draw. You have the Flamberge Dragons, and then you have sometimes Divine Temple. Although Divine Temple, opening Divine Temple with any other combo piece is like honestly really strong. And even if by itself, Divine Temple placing Ash does put pressure on your opponent, because your hand is probably just a bunch of hand traps, and then you get guaranteed follow-up on the next turn because of the Divine Temple. And like Jet Synchron too, you don't have to run Jet Synchron. This is optional. If you don't want to run the break, you don't want to run the break. But like, it's only maybe 3, and like obviously if you run the Kashtira engine, you have Burf. But if you don't run the Kashtira engine, then you don't have the Burf. So you only have like 3 to 4-ish brick cards in your deck, and then the rest of the room you have to put in all this non-engine, like all these hand traps. And to add on to the Jet Synchron point, this deck is more versatile, again, because you have the extra space. You can do more with like your X deck, and more with what you want to do with your end board. You know, Fire King Snake Eyes doesn't really have that much room to change up their plays, main deck wise or extra deck wise. Same with Rescue Ace that can't really add more stuff in the main deck because their main deck is already really large to begin with. But in pure Snake Eyes, if you want to play Synchros, you can play Synchros, and you can have Omni Negates on your board to, you know, protect further against board breakers or back row decks. If you don't want to play Jet Synchro and you don't want to play the synchros, then you can have more room for link plays and stuff like that. The Kashtira engine enables Drago Sack plays with Diabell Star that lets you make an Appaloosa before you even normal summon occasionally. And playing stuff like the Kashtira engine makes your going first even stronger. It's a good play into Max C and under Max C. It rips extra deck cards, which in a heavy Snake Eyes or Fire Dominate format is really big because you have just a lot of juicy targets to rip with Unicorn. Or if you want to focus less on going second or less on going first and more on your going second plays, then obviously you have the hand traps and stuff. You just have a lot of room to play pure Snake Eyes in a lot of different ways. Now, what are the cons with pure Snake Eyes? Well, first off, it has to be said that out of the 3 decks mentioned, that pure Snake Eyes has the lowest amount of actual real starters due to the limitation on the ban list, just 1 Ash and 1 Wanted, and you don't have other engines that can supplement as like half starters or that can combo with your not ideal draws like your Kashtira cards. Kashtira cards, even though they're nice, if you don't draw a Snake Eyes card with your Kashtira cards, you don't have access to your Snake Eyes. Then you can't really play your deck. You're just summoning a Kashtira monster. So yeah, as you can see, 1-for-1, you have to run it in a pure Snake Eyes build. I'm even running Prosperity, which I know sounds crazy, but it's better to dig 6 and like have less options in your extra deck than to dig 0 and just brick and not have a real starter. So that's one downside. And I counted this deck still has 14 starters in it, which is like a 90% consistency to open 1 starter in your opening hand, which is still pretty good. Now that is less than the other 2, and also keep in mind that just having 1 starter isn't enough, because 1 starter gets stopped with 1 hand trap. In order to actually play through hand traps, you need to open multiple of your like 14 starters. Like you need to open Ash plus something like a Witch or a Unicorn. Just opening the 1 starter by itself is not good enough in a meta with tons of hand traps. So yeah, sometimes this deck can brick on like not actually drawing engines, so that's one of the downsides. And yeah, as I mentioned, this because it has the low amount of engine, it is more vulnerable to disruption if on your Ash, because you have less other plays, since the rest of your deck is just mostly non-engine as opposed to more extenders. Now you can build your again the Kashtira cards does alleviate the playing through hand traps a bit. They do help you play through hand traps, but whether you choose to run the Kashtira cards or not, it fixes one problem and introduces another. Because if you play the Kashtira monsters, yeah, it helps you play through hand traps, but also the Kashtira monsters, specifically stuff like Unicorn and Birth, these cards are not good going second. So it helps you play through hand traps going first, but then going second, you're playing into boards more often because you have less hand traps, and then this deck is more vulnerable to actual real boards as opposed to hand traps. Whereas if you don't play that Kashtira engine and you play more hand traps to help going second and stop your opponent, then you open yourself to more hand traps, because then you have less actual extenders in your deck. So it's a give or take. You can't fix both problems with the deck of like being able to bolster your ability to go second while also playing through hand traps. And another minor note is, well, I don't know how minor it will be depending on the meta, but pure Snake Eyes is probably the weakest of the 3 fire decks of playing into floodgates. Stuff like if there's a skill drain on the field, you actually straight up probably can't do anything. Even to something like a rivalry just stops you flat. Whereas Fire King monsters have effects that trigger off the field. They dodge skill drain. You have in-engine removal for spell and traps in the Fire King version, and obviously Kieran can chain to dodge even more on-field floodgates and stuff like that, like chaining to rivalries or chaining to a skill drain to dodge a skill drain. And yeah, you don't really have those plays with a pure Snake Eyes build. It's more streamlined, so you are more vulnerable to the continuous traps. So yeah, those are the pros and cons of pure. Let's move on to the next one. So let's move on to the other Snake Eyes variant, which is Fire King Snake Eyes, which is honestly as much, if not more so, a Fire King deck than a Snake Eyes deck. And notably, we're not going to talk about pure Fire King in this video, because although pure Fire King is a deck, I think most people will agree that Fire King Snake Eyes is probably the more competitive way to play the Fire King cards. And one of the advantages that the Fire King Snake Eyes deck has over the pure Snake Eyes, in my opinion, the entire, like, the biggest selling point and the biggest reason to even play the Fire King version is, in my opinion, because of this card, Fire King High Avatar Kirin. This card is ridiculous. This card is honestly the best card in the deck. This is a main phase quick effect, so it is a combo starter by itself. It is just an extra disruption if you have extra copies of it in hand. You can also add this in your hand as a destruction in your hand for your opponent's turn. But what's really nice is that you can also use this on your turn to dodge disruption, to dodge hand traps, right? Normal summon like Snake Eyes Ash, they Valor it, they imperm chain Kirin, boom. Boom. You still get the Pobbler Surge, you still get the Specialist Pobbler, you still get the original symbol to get your legendary Ponix, and you get the Fire King High Avatar here on the field as a body, and you just dodge their hand trap. This feels like just 3 extra copies of Cross-Out Designator a lot of the times, which, you know, when in a deck, in a format with so many hand traps like this one is, having ability to dodge them with Kirin is huge. And speaking of hand traps, Kirin is the card that you want to see if you happen to get Max Seed. Since, one, if you want the extra buy, you can just chain to Max Seed and then, you know, avoid giving your opponent extra draw. But also, again, you can just keep this in your hand and use it to pop a card on your opponent's turn. That way, you get an extra interruption on your opponent's turn without committing an extra special summon to give your opponents less draws off Max Seed, which is very nice. Among other things you can do with Kirin, again, as the aforementioned ability to play around floodgates, you can pop cards to dodge skill drain. If Kirin itself gets popped, it just destroys a card on the field, non-targeting, so you can pop the problematic floodgates that way. And yeah, this card's really insane. It like just makes the Fire King deck, in my opinion. And also, in regards to the end board that the Fire King Snake Eyes deck makes, a lot of times you're going to end on just like a couple monsters in the field. You're going to maybe end on Whale plus 1 more monster pass, or like Appaloosa plus an Avrata, or not Avrata, but like a different monster pass, like 2 monsters on board, and then the rest of your interruptions, they're in hand, they're in grave. So stuff like board breakers really just bounce off your board. Like, board breakers generally don't do hardly anything. They maybe trade at most with 1 interaction of your board, of your like 7 interaction board, because like 5 of your interruptions are in your grave. So yeah, if you resolve your combo, generally you should feel pretty good about yourself, because the main way you want to stop Fire Kings is with hand traps. And if the hand traps didn't stop you, then, you know, the board breakers are unlikely to stop you after you've already got your setup done. So yeah, that's a nice pro of Fire Kings. Now, some cons for the Fire King Snake Eyes version is there's quite a lot of undesirable draws and like bricks. They're not full garnets at the very least, because if you draw cards like Ponix, you draw Arvada, you can just pop them with your Fire King cards, like your Fire King Island, and you can still play that way. But it's just that you don't really want to draw these, because you can get these for free. Like, if you original symbol spoils for Ponix can get Sanctuary, which gets you your Fire King Island, which then gets your Runic Stone deck. That's how you access your engine. Like, and then you pop like an Arvada. Like, you don't want to draw any of these cards, because you already access them anyways, and it's quite a high number of cards that you don't want to draw in this version. If you run Skyburn, for example, as like a semi-plane to Maxi, where you can just, instead of committing into your full board, you can search this instead as a disruption. This is also an Alpha Floodgate, but again, if you draw this without a real starter, this card is just another brick in your hand. Like, it feels like the only card that you actively want to draw in the entire Fire King engine is Kirin itself, but unfortunately you have to run all of these engine requirements that aren't Kirin that you don't want to draw. So yeah, sometimes your hands contains less playable cards than you would really feel comfortable with. Also, these aren't all the bricks that you could be running. You could up the brick count even more. For example, cards like Snake Eyes Oak and Divine Temple, You notice they're not in this build. Oak can be used to extend your combos further and give you stronger boards, but Temple is a really nice card for certain lines. It comes up if you happen to have access to Ash and Diabellstar, but also Temple is one of your better plays into Max Seed. For example, if your Snake Eyes Ash gets Max Seed, you could just pivot back to the standard Snake Eyes play of summon Poplar, get Temple, Temple plays Flamebird, Oak plays Ash, both in the spell and Trap Zone, and then make an IP. That way, you still end on an IP, and then you get follow up with Flamebird summoning Ash on your opponent's turn, just for 2 draws. Whereas if you don't play Divine Temple, you don't have access to that play. And obviously, we're also only running one Flamberge, and having only one Flamberge makes some lines to play around the Nibiru more awkward. But again, the Flamberge is another brick if you want to keep running it. And then also, if you're concerned about not having enough starters, you can run Alcanix 2, which is another normal summon if you don't have access to your Snake Eyes engine to trigger your Fire King engine. But then that also requires you to run High Avatar Garuna, which is yet another brick. So you can see like you add one starter or like one engine requirement, you add like another brick in the process. So yeah, this is like a more minimalistic build. As you can see, there's only 42 cards and runs tons of hand traps. There are builds that run less hand traps with more engine and are still hot and are like higher deck count size than the 42 here. And it has to be said that like it's kind of a downside, more of a like affecting the way that you actually play Fire King Snake Eyes, is that because we have one Ash and only 3 Bonfire, you effectively only have 4 copies of Ash. And I suppose 1-for-1 is another copy of Ash, so you have 5 copies of Snake Eyes Ash in your deck. And even if you get the deck size down to 40, for example, you have 5 copies of Ash in a 40 card deck, you still only have a 50-50 shot of actually opening Ash in your opening hand. Half your hands that you draw in this deck will not contain Snake Eye Ash in it. And when you don't have access to Ash at the start of your combo, your deck ceiling is a lot lower and your end board is a lot weaker. Because then what are you going to use the original Sinful Spoils on, right? Are you going to use it to get Ash from your deck? That way you can access your Snake Eyes engine. But if you do that and you don't have Ponyx, then how do you access your Fire King engine that way, right? And if you're going to use your original Sinful Spoil to get Ponyx, but you didn't start with Ash, then you don't have all the good stuff from the Snake Eyes engine. You don't have the extra bodies from Ash and Poplar. You don't get the Flamebird fully into more bodies and all of that good stuff. Like, say for example, you have to start your play off with normal summon Poplar to get original, and then original to get Ponyx. Then you're basically just playing standard, like, pure Fire King combos, except probably weaker because you're running a smaller Fire King engine, and you may or may not run Alcanix and all that stuff. You don't have all the good stuff from the Snake Eyes engine if you do it that way. And obviously, you're not gonna, if you start with Poplar, you're not gonna use the original Sinful Spoils to get Ash, because what is that a combo? You don't. Not like you have the Divine Temple. You only have one Flamber Dragon. You don't have Oak in this build, and you don't have access to your Fire King engine that way. So yeah, that's the Snake Eyes Ash limitation being annoying for Snake Eyes variants. Who would have thought? And another maybe a minor thing is that this is, out of 3 decks, this is the build that's the weakest into Droll, and people are already slotting in Droll because of the Ash limit, making Bonfire searching Ash a more common play in your opener, which that hard loses to Droll. But also this deck hard loses to Droll even if you don't open Bonfire like that, because even if you open like a Poplar, if you hard open Ash, if you open Diabellstar Witch to get original Sinful Spoils, at any point, unless you start your play with literally normal summon Fire King Ponyx, it kind of cuts you off of your Fire King engine most likely, because then you can't, if you get Drolled before you summon Ponyx, then you can't search your Fire King Sanctuary area, and you can't get your Fire King Island, and then you can't add Garunix to hand to summon it and then trigger you pop your Fire King monster from deck. So yeah, if people are really afraid or are really respecting Fire King Snake Eyes specifically, then you might see a lot more Droll, and that might hurt a bit more. So yeah, this was the pros and cons of Fire King Snake Eyes. Now we go from the deck hurt most by Droll to the deck hurt least by Droll. Since everyone knows the Rescue Ace main play is Turbulence set 4, which, you know, it sets, it doesn't add, so you can do it on the Droll. Emergency, another key card in Rescue Ace, Special Summons. It's an E-Telly, does not add, so you can just play around Droll that way. And yeah, Droll is generally not going to be able to stop the Rescue Ace player from getting to their main line play, which is Turbulence set 4. And also, probably the biggest perk, or one of the biggest perks of playing Rescue Ace is its ability to play into Maxi. By far, out of the 3 fire decks, Rescue Ace plays the best in the Maxi. You can generally get to Turbulence set 4 in 1 summon at most, if not under 1 summon. For example, they can use Maxi, and you can chain Emergency if you have it to, you know, summon a Turbulence out of your deck, and then yeah, your opponent gets 1 draw at most, and then you get to set your 2 interruptions plus your rescue and your alert, or rescue plus another emergency. Sick. Much better than the Snake Eyes plays in the Maxi, which usually, if you want to end on an interruption or 2, you got to give your opponent multiple draws, or you know, sometimes it's better to just pass your opponent preemptively Maxis, otherwise you're going to give them just way too many cards. Like, for example, they Maxi you before you summon Die Battlestar, and then you're going to have to, give them 3 cards to make 1 interruption? Gross. Just Turbulence set 4, baby. That much safer, much better. This is also the deck that is probably the most consistent out of the 3 decks, because its starter is not Snake Eyes Ash, you know, funnily enough. So because you don't rely on Ash, your starters are not limited. You still have 3 Airlifter. Your bonfire target is Poplar, not Ash. So, you know, you don't depend on this card. You also have 3 copies of Emergency, and you have Rhoda. Imagine there being a 4th copy of Bonfire to search Ash. Well, Rescue Ace has Rhoda to search Airlifter, which is still a starter. And yeah, even 2-card combinations like Hydrant plus Preventer and stuff like that can get you to your Turbulence set 4. So this deck is probably the most consistent out of the 3. Has the most starters, since they're not limited. They're not limited because it's not dependent on Ash. And also, this end board has monsters and spell traps, so it's resilient to certain types of board breakers too. Like, if your opponent just has monster removal or ways to interact with monsters, but not your back row, then, you know, that's Gucci, because you Extinguish and Contain, when you have Hydrant on board, are insanely powerful forms of interruption. And a lot of decks don't have ways to actually interact with back row that safely, so yeah, it's really strong. Now, some cons are the same. While having back row as an interruption is a positive, usually, sometimes it can be a negative, because spell trap removal becomes effective versus you. Stuff like Lightning Storm or Red Reboot or Evenly Matched, for example. Usually spell trap removal does not really do that much versus the other Snake Eyes variants, especially Pure. Pure has no real in-engine interruption in the back row. The Fire King version sometimes has the Quick Play spell, and obviously, if you specifically have Cosmic Cyclone, you can Cosmic the Fire King field spell to nuke their field, but again, most of their interruption is in the grave anyway, so it's like not the biggest deal. And again, it's Cosmic Cyclone, which is a card that's probably not high up on the spell trap removal list right now. But yeah, though, a mass board wipes on your back row, and if you're playing Rescue Ace, can hurt more. So if people are expecting a lot of Rescue Ace, then they might play more spell trap removal board wipes, which hurt this deck more than the other two. Now, you do still have usually some form of monster interruption on your end board, but again, your end board monsters are a lot weaker and like a lot less than the Snake Eyes variants. Also, as you can see, this, if you haven't noticed by now, this deck is 50 cards because this deck's engine is quite big. This deck actually has probably the least room for non-engine out of the three. The reason that I have like still have a decent amount of hand traps in here, including Gamma and Nib, is because this is a 50 card deck. It's really hard to get the deck size down if you want to run a high amount of hand traps, just because you have to devote so much room to engine, and especially stuff like Contain and Extinguish, and Alert and Rescue, the cards that you set off of Turbulence. These cards you don't want to draw, so sometimes it might be like beneficial to run a high deck count size, but obviously, you know, there are downsides to running a high deck count as well. And if you want to get this down to 40, it's not even easy to even easy to find cards to cut, because, you know, let's say you want to cut Impulse and Fire Engine because they're the least important engine, and then what, you want to cut some Imperms as your hand trap because Imperm is probably the worst hand trap in Rescue Ace, because your back row is usually, you know, full, so you don't have that much space to set stuff like Imperms. And then, well, let's say you don't want to run Prosperity, you want to cut down for, like, I'm struggling to find cards to cut. I'm at 45 and I'm struggling. I'm like, I don't see another card that I want to cut at this point. And I cut a lot of cards that I wanted to play. That was the reason why I was running 50 in the first place. So yeah, the large engines sometimes makes it bloats your deck count. And also this deck has, out of the 3 decks, Rescue Ace probably has the weakest follow-up out of all of them, because with Snake Eyes versions, right, they have the Flamberge, and then when Flamberge goes to the grave, Flamberge summons back 3 Snake Eyes monsters, and Snake Eyes monsters each search another card for follow-up, and then the Fire King's variant in particular also has all of the follow-up in the grave, and then like cards in hand, and like all of that. If the Rescue Ace boards gets broken, you don't actually have a lot of guaranteed follow-up, because all of your Turbulence, all of your searches for Turbulence, all of your sets are on the field, and obviously if they get rid of your field, then you don't have anything anymore. Rescue Ace HQ, you need to hard search this, and also it only really gets you 1 draw. You still need to access the Turbulence again to get the set for a second time, and if they wipe your board, then there's a decent chance that you might not have the resources to rebuild your board and get back to Turbulence. So just keep that in mind. The Rescue Ace board is pretty strong and it's resilient because it's both monsters and back row, but if it gets broken, you're in a much worse position than if Snake Eyes board gets broken, for example. So yeah, that's like my opinion of the 3 fire decks. I'm still not quite sure which of the 3 I would consider the best. I think all 3 of these are a solid option, and you can't really go wrong with any of them. And you know, hopefully you found this video at least somewhat useful, or I hope you did if you watched this video the entire way through. Otherwise, I'm terribly sorry for wasting your time, and I really do appreciate you watching the entire video. And if you're not satisfied with this, I promise I'll do better next time. And if you're interested in how the non-fire decks and how the other decks in the format perform for the World Championship qualifier, go check out this in-depth tier list I did on the format after new pack dropped.